Right. So I am gonna do a presentation. It will be about 45-50 minutes, and then we'll allow some time for question. While I'm doing the presentation, please put any question in the chat, and I'm gonna look over it while I'm doing the presentation. Also, I think something important to state is that I have an accent. I'm French, and sometimes it's a little bit hard to hear me, especially if we're not in person. So don't hesitate to ask in the chat for me to repeat or show something again if you cannot understand what I'm talking about. So here we go. I'm going to share my presentation. Go. All right. Can I get a couple thumbs up as the people in video if you can see what I'm
It looks
presenting?
just fine, thank you.
Awesome. Let me pull. There we go. All right, everybody's ready. So today, I'm going to do a presentation about many different things. A lot of my beekeeping experience, my family experience, and the experience that we got around the world. So let's dive in. First, I think this story could not start without my dad. My dad, Nicholas, is about 52, 53 years old right now. He has been a beekeeper for many, many years. He used to be in a boarding school when he was a teenager. And in France, we don't have school on Wednesday afternoon. And so what happened is that he was staying there all week. He wanted to do some activity, and the people were offering either archery or football or rugby and beekeeping. And so he started to do some beekeeping and literally fell in love with it. And so he came back home, and with his dad, my grandpa, when he was about 16 years old, they started to build hives. They didn't have a lot of money, but they had a lot of time and knowledge. And so they built about 300 hives, hive bodies, and about 600 honey shallows, and all the frame that goes with it, all by hand. And then they started to keep bees. At that time, people were starting to understand the value of bees. He was, in the 80s, and so my dad made a deal with the firefighter of the region. There was a couple hours south of Paris, and anytime they had a swarm call, like Gerald, instead of going and removing the bees or killing the bees, well, they will call my dad, and my dad will go with his little truck around and grab all of those bees. And that's how he grew his apiaries, before VAWA, before a lot of things, when it was a lot easier to do all of this. And when he was about in his 20s, he decided to stop kind of like his activity as a beekeeper. He was doing a lot of market honey, candy and things like that, and candles, but he lost a bunch of bees in the 90s with those new kind of chemicals that farmers were starting to use, especially in this region that is a big agricultural region. And he lost most of his hive, or well above 100, which was really heartbreaking for him. And so he decided to put this in pause and went to Paris, starting studying, got a regular job, tie and suit, 9 to 5, and all of this. And then when he was 40, he said, no more, I don't want to do this. It's not fun. I want to do the beekeeping again. And so that was about 15 years ago. I was 12 years old at the time, and he decided to start a company, a business about beekeeping. To give you guys some numbers, so this was about 15 years ago. And the first year he bought 6 hives, and we made 12 split out of them, and that's all we sold that year. And we grew from being in the back of a gardening store, having just like a little shelf on there, to take most of the store and then getting his own store. And then he started to sell bees to hobby beekeeper and equipment and things like that. And then at this time in France, it was in the mid 2000, late 2000, let's say. People didn't really believe in the urban beekeeping. People didn't believe that much that we could do honey in the city, especially that the pollution, heavy metal, things like that would influence the quality of the honey. And so he decided to put a hive in Paris. He just called a building for free, and he said, like, can I please put a hive? And they accepted. And then some reporter heard about it, and then they called him, and they were like, they did an interview. More people heard about it, and then from now on, like, people just wanted him to put bees and teach them about bees and the beekeeping. And so he did a pretty big business in France. to the height of it a few years ago. A couple of years ago, we had about 600 hive on the rooftop in Paris. One of the most famous one, as Gerald said, was Notre-Dame, which I'll talk about in a sec. And he had 4 stores, about 12 employees. There was about 3 beekeepers managing 1,200 hive and producing about little shy of 2,000 nukes every year and selling it directly to consumers, to hobby beekeepers. And so I worked with him since I was 12. I was still going to school, and from 12 to 18 years old, I was working weekend and some nights and most of the holidays doing this, which was not always fun. Let's be honest, when you're 16 years old, 17 years old, you want to do all the things than just working a weekend from a very long day. But it was amazing overall, and I learned a lot, and I got to see all different part of the business and the beekeeping side, which I learned mostly from my dad and the beekeeper around us. And when I was 18, I had the let's say now it's the luck. At the beginning, it was just by not being an 18 years old and not really knowing what I wanted to do. I decided to, a beekeeper came to France, a Californian beekeeper came to France for a conference, kind of like what I'm doing right now. And he stopped at my house and we talked, and he's like, what are you doing? It was December. And he said, what are you doing in the new year? And I said, I don't know. I said, you should come in California and see how we do it out there. And so I went there for 6 months. It was near Winters, California, Vacaville. I don't know if people are super familiar. It's on the way to Sacramento, near Lake Berryessa. Big beekeeper, 5,000 hive, over 20,000 queens every year, bunch of honey as well, and pollination. So it was a world that I had no idea about, the pure commercial beekeeping, just in the field, not many contact with outside people. So that was a huge learning curve for me. And discovering how people were doing in a larger scale, let's say. And so after that, I was hooked. I was at that time 18 and a half, 19. And I said, I just want to keep going. And so for 2 years, I just traveled around the world, South Hemisphere, when it was the spring and the summer here, and then North Hemisphere, and then South Hemisphere when it was the winter in the North. So I could just keep doing full season for 2 years. I visited California, Argentina, Greece, Malta, Sicily, some places in Germany and France. It was just like life-changing, the experience that I had. Those companies were all very different. You went from 5,000 hive to a dad and a couple sons in Argentina in the countryside that were running a few hundred hive on their own, and that was the whole business. So it was very different every time, but I got to learn quite a bit. And then this idea flourished with my dad throughout my travel to maybe expand the family business, maybe go and grow somewhere, because you guys all live in California, but when you're outside of America, when you're outside on the other side of the world, it's literally the dream for a lot of people, and for beekeepers especially, the weather and I know it's controversial, but the almond pollination and this whole thing and history about what is beekeeping in California. And so I decided to move there and expand the family company. And this was about 6 years ago now, 6.5 years ago. And it has been quite an adventure. We bought a few hive. We are selling a lot of hives to hobby beekeeper, a lot of nooks, and full hive as well. We do some pollination and some honey that we direct sell to people on market. And so that's where my travel came in play, my experience with my dad, but also the fact that I met all those people in different climates that are different goals and different parameters with their hive and their environment and what they need to make happen. And so if I was reproducing exactly my father's way, or this California guy or Argentinian beekeeper here in California, would have never worked. We are different environment, different bees. And so, but I took a little bit of all those tips and tricks, and it was, kind of like you guys, when you're meeting here in the association, like asking questions and finding different way of doing, and then compiling them together and learning in California. As Gerald said, we set up right around Walnut Creek. First we were in Brentwood, and then we're around Walnut Creek. And so we have bees mostly in the East Bay. We manage a few hundred hive, and now it's actually my father, my little brother, and myself. We run the whole business together pretty much. And so this has been kind of a blessing so far. And actually 2 years ago, I also joined with my dad, we joined another company called Alveo. Alveol spells like this, it means the bee cells in French, is this little hexagon shape. And we work with this company, which is an urban beekeeping company, a pretty big company. We'll talk a little more about it later on. And I moved to Colorado actually about a year ago. I'm still going back to California to help the bee business out there, but also managing some things here in Colorado and around the US as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about beekeeping in France. I don't see if you guys are asking any question. Give me 1 second. Right, so let's talk about rooftop beekeeping in France. And the way to start that, I think it's with Napoleon, which is something that surprised a lot of people, because now we hear when beekeeping, it's trendy and it's hip, and we are doing all the things with the bees, and it's never been done before. Actually, the funny thing with France, and at least Paris historically, is that Napoleon is the one that kind of removed most of the bees in Paris. They used to be what we estimate now over 10 times what is in Paris right now of beehive when people had homes, much fewer apartments, of course, but they were all keeping bees, you know, because it was a time where there was the only way of getting sugar and getting lights with candles, and so and as medicine, because there's a huge historic of medicine of people using the bees to heal themselves in France. And so they were keeping a lot of bees, and Napoleon kind of pushed all of the farmers away and all of the regular people, asked them not to be able to keep animals and bees, to make the city cleaner and more oriented towards the industry. And so there was a lot more bees before all of this. Which I think is always funny to put in perspective. So as I said, a business starting in 2012, we use mostly Dayton Hive. I don't know how about if you guys are familiar with Dayton Hive. Most beekeepers in the US look Langstroth. Langstroth, there's many sizes of them. For example, Langstroth in Canada is slightly different than Langstroth in the US. It's mostly about the thickness of the wood. Usually the frame are very, very similar. Dayton, you know, it's the similar type of frame, just a little wider and longer. Pretty much they are just bigger frame, bigger hive in general. What we compare it to is that a Dayton 6 frame Nook equals a 10 frame Langstroth, just to give you a little bit of a perspective. So yeah, that's what we run in France on the rooftop and also in the countryside. I think here's something that's going to be very interesting for you guys. I know Gerald is a treatment-free beekeeper, and probably a lot of you are as well. And in France, we used to be more conventional, use quite a bit of treatment, and then slowly we figured out a way to manage varroa. And this way was by moving brood around. You know, as commercial beekeeper, we're always doing splits, and we realize that the best way to be able to remove varroa and remove the pressure from a hive was to move the frame around. And basically we were removing cap brood to make those splits, and usually we're doing 2 to 3 splits per hive. Well, by doing this, overall in the apiaries, there's the same amount of varroa, but there's much less pressure per hive. And so every season we're moving this varroa around and reducing the pressure. Also, it allows us to be able to change constantly the wax. In France, we use mostly the foundation are made out of pure bee wax and not plastic, like a lot in the US. And a lot of beekeepers in France, but especially in the US, in my experience, are using commercial beekeeper, using really, really, really old frame, you know, completely black, that keeps a lot of those chemicals from outside the bees from the plant, but also the chemicals that we're using for treatment and things like that. And I think part of the resistance against varroa, the varroa resistance to the treatment, and also the fact that bees are dying at usually a high rate and not being super healthy in commercial activities. I think it's a lot due to this frame being very old and carrying a lot of problem against the bees. And so basically what we're doing in France, we had a plan that every year we're replacing 50% of the frame. So in theory, no frame was more than 2 years old in France. And the way to do that was to actually taking this cupboard frame full of varroa, putting them in the nuke boxes, selling them to people, encouraging a hobby beekeeper in our region to do the same, to constantly be able to use brood frame the first year, then putting them to the side, reintroducing fresh foundation in the center and pushing those old frames out and then throwing them away. And that was a way that we actually progressed from doing 2 treatments a year to doing only 1 treatment a year. We used to use Apiva and oxalic acid in the winter between Christmas and New Year's. And we just managed to move away from Apiva and were able to only use 1 treatment a year, which was quite of an accomplishment, at least for us. It was quite amazing to be able to do that. So that was a big thing. 1 treatment a year by changing a lot of the frame. Let me see in the chat. Oh, I don't know. Someone posted something about the Alvéole symbol. Oh yeah, the Alvéole symbol, the knife. I don't know if you guys know that. It's a pretty famous knife, but it's a bee on it. So let's keep moving to something I think you guys will be pretty interested about, which is Notre-Dame story. Notre-Dame, as everybody knows, it's one of the most famous buildings in the world. It's a massive church, literally at the dead center of Paris. You have Paris that crossed by a river from east to west, and in the river there's a couple of islands, and one of the island is called like the city island, and there's a plaque in front of the church that is like the center point of, in theory, of Paris and France. Every indication that you see around France about distance to Paris bring you to that place. So it's the very much the center of it. And the bees have been there for a few years now. They are not directly on the church that you can see on the bottom left. They are on the side, a building attached to the church, which used to be where the member of the church were staying, and now it's just offices for people that work at the church. But it's right next to it, literally like stuck to it. And on the 15th of April, 2019, a fire started on the roof of Notre-Dame. We don't need to necessarily go on who did what, but basically they were doing work on the roof of the cathedral to kind of renovate it, and a fire started. I'm sure a lot of you heard about it in the news, and literally the entire roof took on fire. There was a massive smoke kind of channel going around. There was black smoke. It was really, really bad, and it's a very sensible site. So they completely shut down the entire island and the neighborhood around this island because people were worried that some kind of attack or things like that. But it brings us to the bees that, of course, when we saw the fire, we were not able to do anything about it. There was no way. It's one of the most sensible sites in Paris, and there is no way for us to come anywhere close to it. And so we had to wait for about 2 days. And I remember, you know, I was in California, my dad was in France, and we're relaying, looking at news report and trying to see the live video and be able to see the drone video to be able to see if the hive did survive, because as we know, wax melting point is very, very low. And so we're just worried of seeing this waterfall of wax, you know, in front of the hive. This was one of the images that we saw. We could not see really well, and we're still very, very worried. And what happened is about 2.5 days, 3 days after the fire, we're finally able to do that. You know, we called a lot of people and told them we had bees, and the bees did survive. There was 3 hives out there, which was amazing. The reason for that is basically those very old European building are made out of stone wall that sometimes are 3 feet, 6 feet thick. And basically, so you have kind of like a chimney, and the roof took on fire. And then what happened is that the wall didn't even get hot. It was about 70 feet down to the side of it. The entire roof took on fire and then collapsed onto inside the church. But because the thick stone wall, well, the hive that was about 70 feet away from the fire did not burn at all. And the fire burned for a few days, we were amazed about it. We had the luck in some way that this brought a lot of, you know, publicity, and a lot of people were started to be more and more interested about bees and having bees around in the city around them. So that can allow us and gave us the platform to be able to talk a little more about urban beekeeping and the importance of having the bees around. So that's the story of Notre-Dame. I actually did a little bit of a quick little interview with NPR because it was so big that even, you know, everywhere in the world, like people were talking about it. It was pretty impressive what happened for our little bees. So yeah, here's a little bit about Paris. I don't know if there's more question in the chat. Oh, there's a question from Merrily Snow. Replace the wood frame or the foundation. So basically, because we're selling the nooks, we're taking them away. We're replacing the entire frame. The wood doesn't carry, in my opinion, and what I've seen around, it doesn't carry a lot of chemicals or things like that. It's mostly the wax. You know, there is like has a lot of fatty element into it, and so the wax absorb a lot of things. I'm not too worried about the wood usually. But one solution could have been to cut it out. The problem, it's a little harder to sell just random comb to people. So we're replacing the entire frame, the wax foundation. And so let's now move forward from France. And I talk a little bit about Beekeeping in California. Oh, my mouse is acting weird. Beekeeping in California. It was pretty much the same idea, the same way of managing the Valois in France. And then, as I said, about a couple of years ago, I joined Alveo, this urban beekeeping company, and I really want to talk to you guys about this. Let me move this around. Alveo, the urban beekeeping company. So Alveo, our goal is to connect people with nature. That's what we do as urban beekeeper. And, you know, that's really the world I was born in, doing a little bit of beekeeping in the yard, outside, big yard, but mostly on rooftop, mostly to talk about people that are not beekeepers, that don't necessarily want to be beekeepers, but that are curious about what's going on in the world. All those people, you know, living in cities that have no clue how their food is made, where their food comes from, and what is around them, how the world works around them. And so we get to come in and talk to them a little bit about the beekeeping. So Montreal was a company that was created about 9 years ago. It was created by 3 friends in Montreal, Canada. And now it's on 2 different continents. So we are now in Europe and North America, Canada, and the US. There's 7 countries where we keep bees and about 38 cities where we keep the bees. It means 100+ beekeepers, which is also interesting. That might be a little crazy for you guys, is that our beekeepers manage an average of 40 to 60 hives, and most of the people that we hire do not know beekeeping. And so we teach them all of this beekeeping usually by myself in the US and other people in other countries, where we make a full beekeeping plan in their city, and then tell them what to manage, visit them, and keep the ongoing training throughout the year. Usually what we keep in cities, like most of the urban beekeeper, I'm sure here in this association, we only keep 1 to 2 hives, because, you know, sometimes they can be pretty high, and also we don't want to have too much of a high concentration of bees in one place. So urban beekeeping, social beekeeping. I think this is a concept that it's very important. I'm going to talk to it a lot more about it in the next slide. Is that what we are trying to do is very different from just putting bees, making honey, and making a profit out of just making honey and having bees on building. Our goal is to find those big buildings where there's a lot of tenants, a lot of service company, tech company, whatever that can be. Put the bees there, and every time we visit the hive, gather the people, bring them on the hive. You know, we don't wear suits, we're usually in shorts and t-shirt. We tell people, come as you are, come see the hive, come hold the frame of bees, come touch the bees, try the honey, come connect to the hive. And that's really what we're trying to do, you know, plant those seeds, connect them to nature, and be able to show them what is this world that they have no idea about it. You know, I like to present myself usually as definitely not knowing it all, not having all of the answer or the truth, but someone that can bridge them, that can translate to them a world that they don't know about. Oh, that's a very blurry picture, but yeah, social beekeeping, urban beekeeping is it has a lot of challenges, as you can expect. I don't know if some of you guys have your hive. I think I remember someone from your association that in Oakland had a hive on top of their shed. So there was let's say about a story. Well, we keep sometime a hive at 20, 25-story building, which sometimes has some challenges. Overall, the bees do amazingly well, even on rooftop. But yeah, there's definitely this aspect of like, we're trying to feed the nature, we're trying to feed the countryside, we're trying to feed something that was not planned for in cities. You know how trees are in cities, you have a tree and you have a lot of concrete around it. Well, for the bees, we have to find a place that is not used where we can put the bees. And so height sometimes a challenge for us. Temperature as well. I think the coldest hive that we have are in Quebec cities. It's a few hours north of Montreal. And the average, not the average, but the coldest temperature that I usually for a few nights and a few days in the winter is about -40, -45 Fahrenheit. Might sound a little crazy for people living in California, but the bees do really well. But it's like learning this beekeeping, you know, which my knowledge and my travel allow me to be able to understand this and try to play a different way of managing the hive, because we also have hive in Los Angeles, in Phoenix, in Houston and Austin, Texas, that gets very, very hot. And so it's a complete different way of keeping the bees. Also 10 different climates. You know, we have oceanic, Mediterranean, we have high desert, low desert. We have a many different way of many different places where we're keeping our bees. So that's one of the challenge as well. And we're trying to always bring bees that are more and more resistant in those climates. So we're trying to find local producers of queens and of bees to be able to find the best bees that could help us keep strong colony and good colonies up on the roof in those cities. What else can I talk about? The length-throat tent frame, I think it's, you guys are all familiar with that. That's where we keep our bees. We don't use any shallows, we don't use mediums, it's just easier for us to keep it that way. So we use only supers, I think that's how you guys call it, like super of brood, and then 1 or 2 supers with honey, sometimes 3 or 4 even, in places like the northeast of the US where they produce a lot of honey. So we don't do shallows, we don't do mediums, we only use those length of tent frame super size, which sometimes can be a little bit challenging to manage and to carry around, but overall it's an easier way for us to manage our material, because we are only able to do usually 1 harvest a year for each hive. And so that's a way that our frame that we can use for honey production then can be used later on the next years, can be used now in the brood chamber where we could be doing some treatments, and then they can get evacuated as well, kind of like the same system that I talked about in France. Something that Jerome mentioned earlier in the meeting, we are big advocate for doing the mite washes, trying to avoid pretty much like systematic treatments. I know some people treat, some people don't treat, but I think the most important part is understanding why do we do the things. And so a big way for us is training a beekeeper. And the second one is to do mite washes. Another little technique where I will say mite washes is one of the big ones, doing them at strategic time of the year and to be able to understand the varroa pressure that is in our hive. So we do the sugar method or the alcohol method that we use on the rooftop in the yard. We test some portion of our hives. And then decide to do a treatment, not do a treatment, and the different type of treatment. We use pretty much the most classic treatment that are around. It can be oxalic, it can be formic, Hopguard, or Apivar. Of course, we are not using any of the tactic or things like that, but we use the treatment, different type of the year, different climate, different cities. Access, I think it's also a funny one to talk about. I'm sure some of you have your hive in your backyard, and if you ever move it or bring material, you know, you have to walk around the side gate or things like that. Well, for us, when we go on rooftop, you know, you park in a loading dock, you load your little dolly, you talk to a security guard, it brings you to a freight elevator, and then you get to the freight elevator, and you go up the 10-story building, and then you have 2, 3, 6 flights of stairs where you have to haul your equipment up and down, which makes us very strong down at the middle of the season. But also you have the roof, and you have tubings, and you have things to trip on, and you have HVAC units, and you have cooling units, you have a whole bunch of different things. So it is a fun part, but also a challenging part for people to be able to do their beekeeping. But I think it's one of the big parts is how to access a hive. Here we can see a beekeeper in Montreal. You know, that's why we try to keep very gentle bees on the rooftop to be able to talk to people about beekeeping and making them experience beekeeping like directly on hand. So our beekeepers mostly have shorts, pants, you know, t-shirt, but we try to not be wearing the suit so people around us feel a little more confident. We can see a nice little strip of Alveo in that hive in this length for 10 frame that we have up there. Just some picture. This is Toronto. You can see one of the beekeeper inspecting the honey. And then this is myself. Well, we're talking about access. The same beekeeper in Montreal carrying the booting with the dolly going up and down in this little trip hazard. And myself, I'm in downtown San Francisco in this case. I'm carrying a hive on the rooftop, the Bank of the West. The Bank of the West built in downtown San Francisco. It's a very challenging one, but also a funny one to do. We use screen bottom board. If people are interested, I can talk a little more about this. Here is Philadelphia with Wynn, expecting Brandywine hive downtown Philly. So now I'm going to let you guys do a little bit of a Q&A. I'm a little early, but I really want you guys to be able to ask questions. And if you want me to talk about anything, we are about 30 of us in here. So if you could use the chat will be the best, and or maybe unmute yourself.
Yeah, this is Phil. How do you get live bees up through the elevator? Do you cage them in and put a net around them and put them on your back? And that must be thrilling.
Yes, it is thrilling, and it is also, we don't always tell people so they don't freak out in the elevator and suddenly, you know, the door closes and you're bzzz, like that, very loud, and everybody kind of look at you like you're crazy. But no, we rarely use nets. Most of the time we just use hives and we strap them. We put a little foam in the entrance so the bees don't get out. Or, you know, those pronux, the plastic one that are usually like yellow and kind of brick color on the body. Those like latch on nicely. And so we just carry them around in the elevator, on the dolly. We have a little backpack sometime. Some of the most difficult access we have is hatches, where you have a fixed ladders and you have the rope and you have the harness and you have to hold your things around. But usually we don't use nets because we're trying to be careful with the equipment that we use and the bees not getting out. Gregory, do you have a question?
I do. I have a couple questions. One is, how do you handle the smoke? And I mean, like, there's most of those commercial buildings have air intakes at the top of the roof.
Yes, that happens sometimes, rarely, but sometimes it happens that we set off some alarm, or people that are worried because it starts smelling like smoke in their office and they have no idea why. But usually we talk to the people, the security, the engineer, the property management, which is most of our clients. They understand when we come, and we come in cycle of 3 weeks, same day, same time to service the hive, and they just know to close the vents for about a week, for about an hour when we're doing our visits. Also, what we use is burlap. I don't know if everybody is familiar. It's this organic material made out of fiber. Some people use it for like their lawn for grass not to grow. It's a good thing to make smoke, but it has the problem that it turns off pretty quickly and die off pretty quickly, which is really good for urban beekeeping. So we'll light it on for a 10-15 minutes inspection. And then if you don't puff your smoker actively, it will die off, and then it's not smoking anymore, and then we can go down the building.
Yeah, so the other question I had was, what about liability? I mean, do you have to have special liability insurance for being on top of the roof? So
yes, we do. You can imagine the face of the first insurance company that went to see and say, hey, we want to put 30,000 bees downtown San Francisco. And people thought we were crazy. But yeah, we definitely, like, have all of this covered with insurance and things like that, because we're trying to bring that service to our clients. So we cover everything as like a liability insurance with everything that could be included with the bees or about the bees, because that's definitely a worry for those people.
I have one more question. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
So, beehives are pretty heavy, and roofs aren't necessarily designed to carry a lot of weight all the time. So, I mean, do you have to have studies performed on as far as the load bearing before you can actually put a hive up there?
Most commercial building roof in North America and Europe, they are either they will never let us work on it, but they are not like the roof of a house, because you have HVAC units, you have generators, you have the elevator machinery, things like that is directly on the roof and that is extremely heavy. So most of those roof can bear weight, and the one that cannot bear the weight of a hive, which is, let's say from 80 to 120 pounds at heaviest in the season, well, we won't have access. They won't even contact us. So usually, I mean, all of the roof where we put the bees, they can be load bearing.
Okay.
Hi, Quentin. It's Sue.
Hey,
I'm the beekeeper you helped with the bees on the shed.
I was just
And,
mentioning you.
yeah, I know. I heard that. I'm sorry I chimed in late. I was moving a queen who wanted to swarm away to her new place in Oakland here. But yeah, I just want to thank you for your help and coming out when, didn't have many options of people helping me in September. And I stuck with it. And, I've had great mentors in this club. And it's been a fabulous experience. And thank you, for your help early on.
Well, my pleasure. I'm glad you made it. And I know it's a little rough sometimes, but it's very rewarding. We have a question from Bob Batty that said, do you use insulation hives? Do you insulate hive in -40-degree location? So yes, we definitely do. Right now in Denver, where I am, we do insulate hive. Most places that have some kind of Mediterranean or oceanic climate, when it's not too cold, we do not. But for example, Philly, New York, Chicago, and Boston, and anything in Canada will insulate, except Vancouver, and then Denver as well. So what we use is this little shiny bubble wrap insulation. Do people know what I'm talking about? They come at in big rolls, and so we'll cut an insulation around the hive and put it on top of the hive, and usually we remove the hive from the stand.
Reflectix.
Yeah, exactly, Reflectix. And so that's what we use, because if you can see here, we put them in a little stand, and with a full screen bottom board, the air could come under. So we put them directly on the roof, and then wrap the side of them and then the top. And then what we do is we create a little entrance right above the handle right there on the top with the inner cover. So the bees can come in and out in the winter, in the warm days, and they don't have to go all the way in the bottoms. And so usually we insulate a hive. The earliest place is October until sometime, April or May, and that's where we unwrap our hives. Some people actually, we're experimenting. Some people have problems, some beekeeper in Canada, with humidity that come in the hive. So what they do is they use a shim. There's usually about 1 inch to 2 inch, and then in there they put grass, they put different kind of material, and then that draw out the humidity from the hive that gets created from the condensation. Another question from so Sangli, have you ever had claim or lawsuit? So no, we did not. We're very careful about that. But no, people usually that want bees, it's nobody really gets stung. If sometime it happened that people get stung, we have a way, our beekeepers are trained to handle when someone gets stung, but there's no reason that anybody could get too hurt or anything like that. So we didn't have any problem with claims or lawsuit like that. From Gregory, what do you do when the roof needs to be refinished? which I'm assuming it's kind of like refinish means like working on the roof. Well, we just remove the hive. We ask our clients to give us ideally 2 weeks, a week, or even 2 days notice when the roof needs the hive needs to be gone. We come, foam up the hive, close it, bring it out to the yard, and then we'll bring it back up, after a week or after a month or after a year, or sometime if it's going to be like heavy work and it's going to require a lot of time. We don't want to lose this engagement with the tenant. And so what we do is we try to find a different location. What is usually actually pretty fun is that most people have this like build up fear of bees. And so when a property manager contact us or we contact them about putting bees, they put us on the roof in a corner where nobody's gonna see it, and it's like this weird thing on the edge, that not literally on the edge of the building but far away, so because they're a little bit worried that the months go and the years go by, well, people understand it's fun, the tenant want to see it, they want to come, there's no anything dangerous about this. And so what we do is that we bring them down, now on a balcony or terrace or in the park or in front of the lobby. And so usually then the hive get to be shown right in front of the building, which is quite amazing. Phil, have you had an issue with theft or hive or honey? Actually, funny enough, it happened in France several times to my dad and I. Couple times it happened to like what we call urban hive, but that was in a business park. But you clearly see that those people were not beekeeper, because we came there and the roof was moved from the hive, and then you had 10 steps away from the hive, a first frame, and then 10 steps away after that, you had another frame. So clearly someone grabbed a couple frame of honey and the bees probably chased them and they got stung and they kind of threw everything away and then run away. So we found everything. But otherwise, no, in the US, we didn't have any problem. What we used to do in France with the yard is that on the edges of our yard, when it was our commercial, let's say, activity, we'll put the meanest hive on the outside of the yard, because usually if someone come and steal your hive, they're going to come right to the edges and grab one of the hive and not in the middle. And so we're putting the meanest one. So sometimes you'll see, someone that took the hive and then drop it down right away because they got stung. So we don't have that many problem. Have you noticed a different temperament from Tom? Have you noticed a different temperament of bees you keep in different cities, country, and continents? Yes. Well, I would say that the most of the temperament is affected by the genetic of the hive. So we don't use the same genetic that we could use in California, where we have a good weather all year long, no massive bloom, and yeah, once again, an environment pretty favorable for the bees, to places like Calgary in Canada, or Toronto or Quebec, that has a lot harsher winter, where we don't want our hives to get too big in the season and then stay big when it's time to winter and then consume too much food. So usually we use more hardy type genetic, which have tendencies to be a little more spicy, as one might say. But overall, we don't move our bees usually from a city to another, or at least not from a country to another. So we haven't seen too much of that. But also, to be very honest with you, I think a lot about the aggressiveness that at least I've noticed in the same genetic of bees. It's a lot about the health of the colony and the way the beekeepers handle them. If you have a beekeeper that is not careful, knock the hive, knock the frame when they're working, smashing bees when they're putting down the leads or in between the frame, well, it seems like the bees keep notice of that and keeps memory of it, and then they become more and more aggressive. And so that's something that we definitely trying to avoid by teaching our beekeepers. So I would say genetic handling and the health of it. It's like us human. If you're happy and you get out of bed and you're in good health and you have money and a good house, well, you're pretty happy and good at interacting. If you are sick, the first things that people tell you is that you're grumpy, and so you stay at home and you stay in bed. Well, the bees are pretty similar. The healthy bees, usually they are not that aggressive. Question from Jim. Is wind a problem? If so, how do you protect the hive from the wind? So definitely sometimes it can be a challenge, especially in big cities, because if you look at San Francisco in the financial district, well, sometimes you have this wind corridor. You have this big building that makes the wind that might be 10 miles an hour somewhere become a 30, 40 miles an hour in between this building and can just like channel it. So that's something that we train our beekeeper and we try to listen to our bees as well when we find a good location. Because when we go on the roof with a potential client and they say, okay, where do you want to put the hive? Well, it's like, well, there's the orientation compared to the sun, there's the wind, there's all those things that affect it. So we try to shelter our bees and find the best way for them. Sometimes we'll put them lower to the ground and then add a panel. It's a bottom board panel that goes for a screen bottom board to be able to protect them from the wind coming from under. So that's the thing that we do. And definitely also, we don't know the truth and always like to say that the bees know better than us. So when we're going to place a hive and we figure out, well, they're struggling right now, if it's the wind, then we're going to find a different location on the roof, a different location on the property where maybe they will do better. Second question, what have you found to be the maximum building height and the ideal building height for hive? Actually, like, I'll say like 5 to 10 stories is usually the bees seems to do pretty well. Anything above, which is something we try to avoid, but like 50 stories and more is definitely become challenging. The hive usually do okay, but some forager will be able to leave and then sometime not come back. And also if you think about the foraging range, you know, like 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, well, the higher they are, the less far they can go on the side. And so we're trying to not put them too high as well. But I will say the temperature is more something that affect them, especially on the rooftop where it might be reflection of the light and reflection of the temperature. So that's something we're trying to avoid. But 5, 10 stories, it works really, really well. Do you guys have any other question?
Feeding. What are you doing about feeding your bees?
Oh, feeding the bees. So same things. I'm a big advocate of pollen patties, for example. So we don't use them everywhere. Sometimes we use syrup. Sometimes we use fondant. Fondant is like a pollen patty, but just made out of sugar. It looks like a big candy type stuff, white, and then the syrup. So that's the 3 ways we could be feeding our bees artificial feeding, because we use also honey frames. And it depends where we are and what the bees need. Most places in the south, in the west side and the grand US, we have tendencies to use more pollen patties. In the north, we have tendencies to use less patties because there's so much flowering and so much pollen coming in the northeast of the US and Canada. We don't need patties, but we need syrup at the end of the year, because after the harvest, usually it happens in August, you have September, October for them to replenish their stock. And we give them usually about 3 gallons of syrup, 2 to 1, to be able for them to stock up on food to go over the winter. And actually, I'm going to plant a seed maybe here. I just heard about a Randy Oliver article, and that's someone told me about it, so it might be a little far-fetched, but that I always assumed that the 1-to-1 syrup had a stronger effect for the bees to be able to build comb, and that 2-to-1 was more about sustaining and feeding them later in the year. And apparently he made some tests at home in his apiaries and figured out that the difference was about 5% between 2-to-1 and 1-to-1 syrup. The 1-to-1 syrup and 2-to-1 syrup, there is only 5% difference about the amount of wax that the bees built. And so that's something we're going to start trying potentially and see how that works. So
I heard that 2-to-1 syrup, they store as honey, and the 1-to-1 they use as nectar. They would use nectar. That's why I learned to, and that's why I thought so. But apparently, well, actually the difference is not that big. And for beekeepers, it's easier to find a 2-to-1 than a 1-to-1 unless you're making it at home. But for us, we buy it. And so we need to cut it, and it could ferment faster and all of those things. So that was just an interesting thing that came up recently for us to be maybe considering that. And what do you like for, like, do you use Ultra Bee, Mega Bee? You make your own? For the syrup? For patty. Oh, for the patty.
I like the Ultra Bee. I think it's an easier one. We are not doing our own. I've done a lot with a lot of other beekeepers doing their own patties. Us, it's just like we have a huge amount of hive, but in 37 different cities. You know, we have thousands of hive, but just a few per city. So it's hard to have all the material and control the quality of the patties and things like that. So we usually use the Ultra Bees to do that. And sometimes I forgot the name, but those winter patties. Those winter patties to before the winter. A question from Kevin: do you have water access issue? I'm missing some question, but I'll come back to it. Do you have water access issue, assuming ants are not a problem? You're right, ants are rarely a problem. You know, we rarely have skunk 10 stories up or raccoon or things like that as well. So ants are not really a problem for us. Sometime in some locations directly on the ground, but the stand help quite a bit to deal with. For water, the good part about urban beekeeping is that most park and gardens and balconies and any flowers that you may take care of, well, they water them regularly. You always have a pond or an irrigation system, something leaking somewhere for them to find water. And we also provide them with a mason jar of water at every visit in the entrance of the hive for them to be able to have some water. Nicole, what kind of difference did you see between all the beekeepers' technique in the country visited while you were younger? Did you learn anything unique that is different from the US? Oh boy, well, there's a lot there, because yes, there's many things that I learned that were so different. Once again, like it's literally like, you know, asking cooks the recipe for doing bread. Like they're all making bread, they're all doing beekeeping, but all of them are doing slightly different. I don't know, random stuff, little technique. Well, in Malta, we painted a lot of the hive for the orientation of the hive. So what we were doing is we were providing signage and colors and things like that in the apiaries directly on the hive for the bees to be able to orient themselves. And we saw massive difference for the way the colonies were managing themselves by being able to go back to the right colonies and things like that. When you drive around the highway in California during almond pollination, you have thousands, tens of thousands of hives usually looking exactly the same. Well, that's something we were trying to avoid. So yeah, that's one example. I won't give you too much. Comment on the picture, not a good example of safe beekeeping. Beekeeper is in a bad position and she has to go back up quickly. That's a fair point. If the beekeeper, you know, that's not really something that we encourage usually. She had a fit in there, but yeah, it's not a great example, let's say, of the beekeeping stuff. She's an experienced beekeeper and most likely won't have to go to back up quickly, but yes, it is fair enough to comment that, let's say. Would you elaborate on how the removal of all the works can reduce the hive's susceptibility to varroa mites? So basically, you have the foraging mites, you have the mites, the varroa mites that are on the brood, that are around, and then you have the female mites that are in the cells that will lay let's say the babies in there to make it easier. They lay the babies in there, they'll feed on the pupae and the larvae, and then when this hatch, then they will be able to go around and then bore again and do all of their cycles. Well, what happened is that when you're removing, I'm assuming you're talking about both, but when you're removing those cap brood to make splits, well, you are actually removing those female that are quote unquote pregnant. And so you're able to remove the varroa pressure by removing a bunch of those young varroa and those female varroa from the hive. The reason we remove cap brood, maybe it's also an interesting perspective for you. The reason we're removing cap brood is for two reasons. Is one, if you're removing open brood, you're removing young bees that are here to feed the hive, to feed the babies that are able to do all of the job in the mother hive. So you're taking a lot of bees away. Also, if you're introducing open brood to a new split, well, two things. They need the bees to take care of it. And two, they need a lot of resources to feed those larvae, which are the beings that consume the most from the hive. So you need workers and you also need a lot of food, not ideal for the splits. It's also when the splits, you don't have a lot of forager bees because most likely the forager bees stayed with the mother when you were doing your splits during the day, they were outside. And so you're taking only young bees with you, and especially the one that hatched. Well, the splits, you're going to give them food and brood. And when this brood is going to hatch, well, there's going to be a bigger population that is able to do all of the different job of the hive throughout their lives. It's not all the bees that are going to die almost, so they need resources, where it's the younger one that could do all the job, grow the population, bee nurses, bee builders, bee cleaners, and then become foragers, for example. So that's the reason for that. And then, so the wax, basically, you know, if some beekeeper was using a treatment, let's say like Apivar, and then you have then extraction of this frame, where there's chemicals that stay on the frame that get coated on the wax from all those treatment, that either beekeeping treatment or treatment that farmers use in their land, in their field. And so the problem is that all of these get absorbed by the wax and stay on top of the wax and inside the wax. And the problem is that one, that weaken the colonies, and two, I guess a comparison I can make, remember the kings of France, they used to take little amount of poisons regularly to be able to be resistant to it. And so by getting exposed, or like the stings from the bees, by getting a little bit of doses of this venom, this poison regularly, well, what happened is that they were more and more resistant to said poisons. What happened, the same thing with the varroa, is that the varroa in the cells get exposed to this molecule of the hobguard, of the apivar, of the tactic, and then they're getting more and more resistant by getting a constant micro exposure to it. And so that's why I think by removing this frame, cycling them out, cycling this wax out, we actually making sure that the varroa is not getting more and more resistant to our treatments. Do you ever sell Apis mellifera mellifera, the German black honeybees? Actually, it's a funny story. I could have mentioned it. In France, so this is the Apis mellifera mellifera, the black bees, was also in the northern part of France where we are from, and Germany, and it's the endemic, the native honeybees that is out there. And around the 80s, the 90s, there was importation of different genre of honeybees, and the problem is like we can lost it. The problem with the black honeybees, the Apis mellifera mellifera, well, it's pretty aggressive. It's pretty rustic, let's say. It makes pretty small colony that don't swarm that much, but they don't grow crazy big and make a lot amount of brood, and they don't make a lot of honey, but they're pretty resistant, and you know, they have specialized, they have evolved in the environment of northern France and Germany, and so they know perfectly how to evolve the size of the colony and the amount of resources that they need. So they are per se not a good commercial bees, because they won't make you enough brood to make splits, or at least a lot of them, and they won't make you enough honey to actually have a big production of honey. And so we had that bees that stay usually in one box size, made a little bit of honey, didn't grow too much, pretty resistant to disease as well, and then will then survive really well for the winter. So of course, commercial beekeeping, economic, and things like that push beekeepers to import different type of bees, like the Italian one, and then we add kind of disappear and lost the value of this German black bees, the Apis mellifera mellifera. So my dad actually worked with a researcher from the national lab in France that was trying to, not purify is definitely not a good word, but to find the original genetic of this Apis mellifera that is not, has been mixed with other kind of drones of the genre Apis mellifera. And so what happened is that they created a conservatory. And so the way it was is that some places in France, in the Paris region, they created conservatory that were going from half a mile, 2 miles, 5 miles, 10 miles, 30 miles, where in the zone of the first 5 miles and then 10 miles, you were not allowed to have any other type of bees than the Apis mellifera mellifera. And then in the 50 miles, it was encouraged, strongly encouraged. And so what happened is that this researcher created this conservatory and was artificially inseminating and finding those Apis mellifera mellifera, and then we'll give them to my dad, and then my dad will create nooks and will create splits and hives made with that Apis mellifera mellifera genetic, and then be able to sell them to hobby beekeeper in those conservatories. So that was a way to repopulate with Apis mellifera around. And actually the funny story is Apis mellifera is pretty aggressive. So it's hard to requeen them. It's hard to requeen them. And so what we're doing is using Italian bees to create split, let's say 3 frame of brood, 2 frame of honey. And then we're introducing a black queen in there, and then be able to after 45 days, after the 4 new generation of bees, we only had black bees, and then able to sell them. We try to make split with the black bees. First, they don't produce enough brood, and the second one is most likely they will kill that queen and not accept her. So that's what we're doing, a little trick to be able to have only pure Apis mellifera and mellifera. Jim, if I visit Paris, can I visit the rooftop hives near Notre-Dame? Well, unfortunately, it's a little hard right now because of COVID, and because also that with the terror attack that happened in Paris, it's actually pretty hard for anybody to go in this type of very, very famous building. If you do go in France, if you do go to Paris, please let me know, and I can, maybe orient you to all the building in downtown Paris where you could see the hive. But Notre-Dame, it's very unlikely, just because now it's pretty protected after the terror attack that happened. Tom, could you chat about why you prefer screen bottom boards? It seems solid bottom board will be useful on roof to prevent updraft. Well, the whole talk about bottom boards. I like the bottom board. I think it provides a lot of good ventilation. Maybe not, it's not as much considered in California because of the dryness, how dry, the lack of humidity in the air, but many other places in the US, it's very advantageous some time of the year to be able to have a full bottom board, open bottom board for the hive to be able to dry itself faster. And also for the hive to keep themselves cleaner so that things won't stay inside the hive if the bees are not super hygienic, but be able to fall through, and the ability to close it over the winter. I've tried many different types of bottom board. What we use with my dad and my brother in California is fully enclosed bottom board. What we use at Alveo is fully open bottom board. It is very, there's pros and cons for everything. My advice, which I learned from several beekeepers in France, I would say the ideal one will be about, what is that in inches? Maybe about 4 inches towards the back of the hive. That will be a way for them to stay clean, having some updraft and having a control of humidity without having too much of it. But try them out. It depends where you are, even in the Bay Area, where literally you have almost 10 different types of climates in the Bay Area. I could not tell you one that is better than the other, but you should try different one. And I think one of the essential part is being able to modulate it throughout the winter. If you look throughout the season, if you look at most bees when they set up in a trunk, a natural swarm, well, usually there's only not one hole. There's 2 or 3, some or in the back, some in the front, some higher and lower in the trunk. And what happens is throughout the season, they will literally propolize it. So sometimes there's just a little bit of air that goes through, sometimes nothing, sometimes a bee, and sometimes 10 bees. And so they will play with it throughout the season. And I don't know if you have a lot of properties where you are in the Bay, but they will reduce, in Brentwood, they do that. They reduce the entrance of the hive with propolis. You have them control for predator, and also limit the amount of air coming inside the hive and deperdition of temperature. So it's letting your bees propolis around. As Marla Spivak say, it's very, very important. Gerald, are the beekeepers spread out enough that robbing isn't a problem? Yeah, I mean, the hive, the beekeeper, they all part of the same company, but we are careful for this with the hive. And I think it's a lot about how happy are our bees and how do we manage them and the practices of the beekeeper. So overall, robbing is not at all a problem for us, but because we're taking all of those precautions to make sure that we don't get to a robbing situation. That's a lot of questions. Did I miss any? Do you guys have any other question? If there's any other question coming? No, I think that's about it. Please, guys, I will stay on for. Thank you very much for listening and tuning in and asking all these questions. It is a real pleasure. I'll stay on for a few more minutes. If some of you have any question, want to talk about anything that I presented or curious about anything, please let me know. I would love to answer as much as I can.
Thank you very much for sharing your evening with us.